Until lunch, I want to talk about Adolf Reinach's theory of social life. Reinach was a legal theorist and at the same time a phenomenologist of the so-called realist tradition. He died young in the World War I at the age of 34, so we don't have a substantial corpus of writings which remains from him, but he was a Husserl student, and he was such a promising one that when he died, Husserl told of him that he had aided Husserl himself in his progress towards pure phenomenology. His monograph of 1913, The A Priori Foundations of a Civil Law, is where he gives his theory of social acts, and it can be seen as a systematic theory of speech acts, a contribution to linguistic phenomena as belonging to the world of action. And his work was not known to the English language speaking speech act theorists until the 80s, but it's very similar, as you will see. And he has the prominent example that he uses in this monograph is the example of promising, which Austin and Searle as well treated as speech act theories. So let me just contextualize it. He also has, for theory of social acts, he also takes the example of property, but I have almost no idea of because of your law, so I will, of course, just focus on the example from now. To contextualize a little bit, Reinach was a member of what we call the Munich Circle. There was this highly intense debate in the beginning of the 20th century in philosophical circles about the question of psychologism. The debate was whether or not logical, metaphysical, ethical, aesthetical concepts should be reduced to psychology. Whether all these disciplines we could understand in terms of psychology. And proponents of psychologism, and one of them was Lips, who was as well Reinach's supervisor in his PhD. He can be seen as one of the proponents of psychologism. These advocates of psychologism would say that yes, logical concepts and other disciplines could be reduced to psychology. They are all a matter of how we think, how the subject comes to think. So, for example, the principle of non-contradiction in logic is a logical principle that you cannot have P and not P at the same time. This principle, proponents of psychologism would say that this is just a logical principle. It's about the impossibility for the subject to think at one time P and not P. It's just a matter of impossibility of the subject to think as such. It's not a logical principle itself. And then we have on the other camp, of course, those who thought that we should not reduce logical and other disciplines to psychology. And on that other camp, there was, for example, Husserl, who was anti-psychologistic. And now, Lips had founded an academy in Munich, and the members of the academy, the students and his fellow colleagues, all participated in this academy. There were gatherings every week, very lively debates in psychology. One of the members of and Reinach was also the members of this group. We call them the Munich Circle, the Munich Phenomenological Circle. And one of them was Reinach. One other person was Johannes Dauber, who was a senior member of the Munich Circle, and he went to Göttingen when Husserl was in Göttingen at the time. At the time Husserl had investigated his published his logical investigation. Logical investigation published at 1901. Just at the beginning of the 20th century, logical investigation was actually the manifest for Husserl against psychologism. And Albert, when he when he learned about logical investigations of Husserl, he brought it back to the attention of the Munich Circle, and they all became interested, and they went one by one to Göttingen to join Husserl there. And Reinach was one of the first students of Lips who went to Göttingen to join Husserl. And the idea, very roughly, and the crucial, and then later, these guys who were in the Munich Circle who went to Göttingen to join Husserl against psychologism, they rebelled against their professor lived. These guys later founded what we call realist tradition of phenomenology. They are realist phenomenologists. The crucial concept in phenomenology is the notion of intentionality. As you know, the idea is that mental acts and states are intentional, that is, they are directed towards some object. They have this, they refer to some object, they refer to something beyond themselves. So, for example, when we talk about love or hatred, love or hatred are intentional states in the sense that they're directed to some object, they refer to some object. Intentionality is the aboutness, they're about some object. When I think about the inflation in France in 2020, my thought is about the inflation in France in 2020. This is what we call intentional. Now, very roughly, the idea in Husserl was that subjective, because it was exactly an anti-reductionist, anti-psychologistic account. The idea of the subjective acts and states of the mind have an objective content. They have an intentional content, and this objective content of our subjective act of the mind mediate the intentionality, mediate their direction. They're being directed to the object. So subjective acts are directed to the object which transcends the mind through these objective contents. And the task of phenomenology is to study these various kinds of subjective acts and these various kinds of objective contents. This is what we should do, and you see that this is an anti-reductionist. This is against psychology. So now, what interested the Munich Circle in in the logical investigation, what made it the case that logical investigation became like the Bible for this Munich Circle was the idea that what interested them was particularly the idea that subjective acts refer to objects in the world, to objects or states of affairs which transcend the mind, which have their own structure, which have their own existence, which have their own properties. And this was what interested them, the objects that we were directed towards. And so they were involved with the description of the properties and structures of the objects which transcend the mind, completely anti-psychologistic. And then they had some idea. They had also these guys in the university, which became the realist phenomenologists. And the realist phenomenologists had this idea that there is an ontology of objects. Ontology coming from ontos, Greek, meaning being, what is, what there is. So ontology of object is the study of beings, what things are. And these realist phenomenologists had actually three main ideas. They had this, first of all, they thought that there are a variety of objects which exist independently of any subject in order. So objects exist in themselves, and this is what we call their realistic approach. This is what we call them realist phenomenologists. They have this metaphysical realism that there are a variety of objects which exist in the world. And then these objects are of different kinds. They are of different fundamental categories that we have to study, and we should not reduce all of them to one category. So this is what we call their, say, anti-reductionism. Each type of object should be studied in its own, and it should not be reduced to one category. This is why psychologism is Iranist, because he said that because the logical principle of non-contradiction has nothing to do with how people think, how the subject thinks. It's a category, it's an object, and it's a logical object, should be studied on its own with its properties and should not be reduced to any other discipline. And then they had the third idea, which was that now these objects that transcend the mind, that have their own being, they have their own properties. So they have their own essence. They are constituted by essences, and essence means essence is like the whatness. They have a whatness, what they are, and we have to study the essences of the objects. They have essences, we have to study them. We should get rid of our preconceptions. We should look at the objects as they are and understand their properties of their own. This oneness, or something Reinach calls it the zone, the being such. being sort of the object, which make the object have the essential properties it has. Essential properties are the properties that an object has, that an object should have for it to be the kind of object it is. An essential property is something that without it, the object could not be said to be the kind of object it is. So we have to look at the essence of objects and look at their essential property. And then they have an ontology of objects. They say that not only are there objects and events, like properties and events in the world, but also there are states of affairs in the world. Realist phenomenologists had this idea that you have two kinds of objectualities. We have objects, either abstract objects like properties, or concrete objects like this glass. And also we have states of affairs. States of affairs are something, are things in the world. States of affairs are actually what we believe or what we affirm. When I think that the earth is round, the earth is being round is what we call a state of affairs. That the things are such and such, this is what we call states of affairs. They are the object of our propositional attitudes. We think that when we think, we always think that something is the case. And this something being the case is what we call the state of affairs. Now, realist phenomenologists thought that states of affairs are things in the world. So when I say that the lawn is green, the lawns being green, this is something which is in the world, which makes my judgment true. So finally, for them, it's states of affairs which make the judgments true or false. This is why, for realist phenomenologists, logic is that we call deflatedly in analytic philosophy, we say that logic is about propositions. For realist phenomenologists, propositions are the content, but they have a correlative, they have a corresponding thing in the world which corresponds to them, the state of affairs. So logic is about the states of affairs themselves. Logic treats logic as this principle of non-contradiction for realist phenomenologists is actually effectively about the fact that two states of affairs, that P and that not P, that they cannot obtain in the world at the same time. So they think that these logical principles are actually ontological principles. They have their essence. They have their essence in the things themselves. So realist phenomenologists have this realistic approach about the state of affairs as things which are in the world. And Reinach in particular defends the idea that logical principles are a matter of ontology. They come from the essence of things themselves. They're not ways of thought. They have nothing to do with it. They come from the objects, from the states of affairs themselves, and states of affairs are something in the world. Now, with this very fastidious introduction, now Reinach has, like other fellow realist phenomenologists, had this goal of developing a realistic approach as faithful to phenomenological method. And because he is particularly interested in the entanglement of the consciousness and the reality, in the way that act structures and object structures are related between themselves. This is what interests Reinach the most. And he has not, because he's very young, he doesn't have really an detailed exposition of his phenomenological approach, but he has this remarkable lecture that he gave in Marburg in 1914. The name is it's published as Über Phenomenology, concerning phenomenology. And in this paper, he says that this is an anti-psychologistic approach he developed. He says that when I see a red rose, the red rose is a thing in the world. It's a physical thing. But my seeing it has nothing physical. It's a psychical or mental. My seeing the red rose is mental, but we should not confuse my seeing or my admiration or my feeling or my joy upon seeing that red rose. We should not confuse these mental attitudes, these feelings and intentions which are mental and psychic. We should not confuse them with the seen rose, with the seen red rose. The seeing should be distinguished from the seen object. The seen object is an object, and the error of psychologists was that they reduce everything to psychology. And so now it's sure that the color itself is not something some independent material thing in the world. And he says that this is why exactly we have confused. We have thought that because color is not an independent material thing in the world, we have reduced it to something mental, which it's not. It's something in the world. We should never confuse the things which are subjective, which are about our feelings and intentions, with the things which are seen or which are intended, which have a different ontology. And so he invites us to distinguish between essence and existence. Of course, the color has not a material independent existence, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an essence. It has an essence. We have to look at the objects in themselves and try to see their properties. For example, that orange lies between red and yellow. This is the property of orange as color. Orange is such that it lies between red and yellow. This knowledge is not something that is derived from experience. It's not grounded in experience. It's something that is self-evidently see. It's part of the essence of orange to be between red and yellow. So for Reinach, not only we have things in the world with their own properties, but also of the things, there are laws which are grounded in the essence of the thing itself. There are connections between things which are essential connections. There are properties of the things which are essential to those things themselves, in the sense that I gave, in the sense that the thing will not be what it will not be of the kind it is if it didn't have that property. So for example, it says that points or lines are not something real in the world, are not something because point, but when I put a point, it's always the surface, it's the point. The concept of point or the concept of line are something abstract. They don't have an independent real existence in the world, but it doesn't mean that there's something mental. It lies in the essence of it's part of what a line is, to be the shortest. It's in the nature of line that the straight line is the shortest between that connects two points. This principle lies in the essence of line as such, although line is not an independent material thing. And as well, I said orange lies between red and yellow. So here we have it's necessary. It's necessary. It's a necessary state of affairs that orange lies between red and yellow. But this is not a necessity of thought. It doesn't have. It's not. It's the necessity of the thing itself. The orange itself is such that it lies between red and yellow. It's not that we must think so. It is that things must be so. It's an essential necessity. It's not an epistemological necessity, as we say in philosophy. And so this is the notion of a priori laws that he introduces. There are a priori laws which govern objects in the world. And if you look without, he invites us to look without presupposition, to intuit the essence of things themselves, and to see their immediate connections and the immediate a priori laws which hold of the essences of things. And for Reinach, there are two features of a priori laws. First, they are necessary. Second, they are universal. The universal in the sense that they hold of everything which is of that kind. Everything which is orange is between red and yellow. So it's universal in the sense that it holds for everything which is of that kind, and they are necessary a priori laws in the sense that the thing cannot fail to have that property. If an object for an object to be of this kind, it should have that property. It's necessary. It's necessary that it has that property for it to be the kind. So these are two features of a priori truth. The notion of a priori Reinach, and this notion actually comes from Kant. Comes from Kant, but it has been made known by Kant, and Kant also said that a priori laws have this universality and necessity. But the problem is that for Kant, since the notion of a priori is an epistemological matter. It is that it's a matter of how we come to know. It's about our knowledge of the world. Our knowledge of the world is such that we know orange to be between red and yellow. But for Reinach, a priori is because he's a realist phenomenologist, the things that are really adequate is another epistemological question. It's an ontological question. It's because things are such that it belongs to their nature, to their very nature to have these laws holding effect. And then there is this is the first criticism that Reinach does of the notion of a priori as it was conceived in the philosophical circles. And so the criticism is that the necessity in question, when we're talking about necessary laws, it's not a necessary clause, but it's a necessary of being. And so, because it's independent of our thought, it obtains whether or not we grasp it. It has nothing to do with our way of grasping them, our way of thinking them. These laws hold of the things themselves, so independently of whether or not we grasp these laws. And the second criticism that Reinach does is that he thinks that the notion of a priori, as it was conceived, was very strictly limited to a particular domain, to the domain of formal language, to the domain of formal objects, or to Newtonian mechanics. But Reinach tells us that if you open your eyes, you see that the a priori should not have been restricted to this small range of objects, but we can find a prioris everywhere. For example, the fact that tone, the notion of tone, there is an intensity. You can have no tone. It's a property of being a tone that it has some intensity. This is an a priori law for Reinach. It is self-evident. It is immediately intelligible. And there are many other objects in the world. We shouldn't have restricted the notion of a priori only to limited domain. It's much more wider than we want. Now, what actually we could guess he wants to do is that he wants to apply his phenomenological intuition, realistic phenomenological intuition, to the domain of the civil law. And he wants to tell us about the a priori foundations of the civil law. So, I'm going to start directly. There is, I think. Okay.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, when discussing the example of tone, you mentioned that it is self-evident property of tone that it has a certain intensity. But being self-evident seems to be an epistemic property, and I was wondering if that's
it's actually yeah, it is. Of course, I mean, a priori laws are grounded in the nature of the things. They are not grounded in the ways we look at them. They are not grounded in our knowing them. But of course, they have intelligibility. Of course, they have this epistemological narrative. But for Reinach, this is not a distinguishing mark of them. This is just a consequence of their being essentially such. If we have this immediate intelligibility, because things are such. So of course, we have also this epistemological notion, but it's just the consequence of the way things are. The epistemological part is the consequence of the ontological. It's not itself the distinguishing mark. Now we want.
May I have a follow-up question?
Yeah.
What is the role of this self-evidence exactly in Reinach's conception? Because, well, we could have some properties of the word that I would say that would be a priori, but I'm relating to this qualia problem and so on. For example, we do not perceive some kind of waves, but we could through some physical instruments. So would Reinach accept that there are some a priori properties of the word that we could perceive if we would have different cognitive mechanisms or something like that? So would Reinach accept that there are a priori laws that are not intelligible to us at the moment, let's say?
Yes.
Okay.
And he says that we even don't have the capacity to know all of them. And that's exactly why they are independent of our grasp of them, because they are there whether or not we exist here. It's not the radicality of this approach. Of course, it becomes much more radical when he applies it to the civil law. And I will come back to this and self-evident. So, now what Reinach wants to do in the book is that he wants to criticize a point of view. The point of view that he wants to criticize is that we could say, well, 2 multiplied by 2 equals 4 is a fact which exists independently of being understood. It's timelessly valid and independently of being posited by men. But propositions of law, for example, that a creditor can transfer his claims without the consent of the debtor, that of course belongs to our present day laws. It is not timelessly valid. It is not timelessly valid. It is dependent on restricted to certain time, and is dependent on a system of positive law that has created this to be valid. So legal propositions and even legal concepts do not have a being independent of any system of positive law. And even basic legal concepts such as property, obligation, claim, rights, and representation, even these basic legal concepts have been produced and created by law. So for example, property is that the idea is that a man, because against the ill will of his greedy fellow man, had to find a way to protect his dominion over things. This is why, because otherwise we are so greedy people, and this is why positive law came into the scene to protect each individual's dominion over things, so that when the dominion of a man over a thing is protected by the law, it is called property. So both the property itself as well as the rules which regulate it and the conditions for it to come to be, etc., are all products of the positive law. This is exactly the conception that Reinach wants to criticize. The point of view that Reinach wants to criticize is that legal propositions and legal concepts are creations of lawmaking factors, and they do not have a being in themselves independent of any system of positive law. And Reinach, against this conception, wants to claim the first there are basic legal entities which have a being of their own, and this will be his realistic approach. There are legal which have an independent existence. And second, so we should not reduce them to other categories. And then that if we look at the essences of these entities, we see that there are laws which hold of these entities, which are essential and eternal, which are a priori laws which hold of these entities. So they're not at all matters of creation. They pre-exist as human beings. They are even presupposed. They are presupposed by the positive law, and in no way it is created by the positive law. So let me start with the first name. What are legal those basic legal entities and structure? He uses the term rechtliches Gebilde, which is translated in English as legal entities or structures or formations. But actually, legal may not be a good word, because if we have this impression that legal is related to law, to positive law, because besides the right, this means pre-positive law. So maybe I can just keep rechtliches, but the idea is that there are basic concepts of right, not if I say legal entities, it's not. Of course, that's the point. It's not legal in the sense of created in positive law, but it's rechtliches, meaning like basic concepts of right, which are independent of positive law. So I would prefer to say rechtliches. So the idea is that these legal entities or rechtliches entities are things which exist by themselves, which are completely independent of our grasp. And the examples that he has for these are like obligations, claims, and property. And I will remain to forget property. I will remain with the question of obligations and claims. Obligations, claims, and property are concepts of right, which are pre-positive. And then imagine that one source for claims and obligations is the act of promising. When I promise John to wash his car, by the act of promising, there is a bond which is created between me and John. There is an obligation which arises in me, a claim which arises in John. So promising is an act which produces claims and obligations. When I promise, something new enters the world. A claim arises, an obligation arises. Now, claims and obligations are rechtliches entities which have their own existence. But what are they? What are claims and obligations? They are something. We agree. We cannot say that they are nothing. They are something. But if we want to see what they are, it becomes foggy, because you have to take and consider this idea that for realist phenomenologists, I said that they have two objectualities. We have objects and we have states of affairs. Now, objects is a category of objects for realist phenomenologists. Objects are either real or ideal. So real objects can be mental or physical. For example, my feeling or my perception is a mental real object, and physical, like this is a physical object. But then we have ideal objects, which can themselves be individual or general. For example, individual ideal object is a number. General ideal object is a property of being redness. The redness is a general ideal object. This is for realist phenomenologists. And the distinguishing mark between real and ideal objects is their relation to time. Ideal objects are timeless, but real objects are restricted in time. Now, if you consider claims and obligations, it's clear that claims and obligations are not something physical. That is true. But are they something mental? Reinach, with his anti-reductionism, completely rule out this question that claims and obligations is something mental, because, of course, they should not be reduced to our experience. My experience of being obliged has nothing to do with the obligation, whether or not I really have an obligation. I can promise John and or other obligations which can last for years, but my experience of being obliged cannot be present at any time when I sleep or when I'm unconscious or when I die. We can have, so obligations are not the same thing as an experience of being obliged. So I may feel obliged and there is something happen. We may feel entitled to something, although there is no real entitlement for us, or we may, vice versa, we may have an obligation that we even don't know about. So they are not mental objects, obligations and things. They are something real, but they're neither physical nor mental. Are they ideal? No, they are not ideal because the mark of being ideality is timelessness, but obligations and claims are not timeless. They arise at certain points of time, they last for a definite time, and then they're extinguished. They are realized at some point, and they are related to time. They are real at some time, but they are not real timelessly. So they are something say they're peculiar kinds of objects. Reinach says that they are temporal objects of a certain kind that have their own independent being because they are, say, transcategorical. They cannot be put in the classical categorization of objects as advocated by realist phenomenologists. Now, promising is when claims and obligations come to exist, they are out there. They are something which are real. There is an obligation established in the world when they are. And then they extinguish and it's over. One source of claims and obligations is the act of promising, but there are other sources. For example, if someone takes away from me something that belongs to me, then he has an obligation to return it to me. But promising is one source of claims and obligation. Now, I said that there was a second claim. The first claim was that there are these actually entities which have an independent being of a particular kind. They have their own ontology. And then the second claim is that there are a priori laws which rule of them. What is this notion? It's that when the entities are governed by what we call essential or eternal laws, which are, as I explained in the whole framework, they are immediately intelligible, they are self-evident, they're grounded in the essence of the hashlish entities. They can be known by insight and independent from the consciousness which grasps them. So, for example, take the example that an obligation dissolves as soon as the thing is not, as soon as the thing for which you have the obligation. This is for Reinach and a priori law. It's grounded in the essence of obligation. It is what obligation is. It's part of what an obligation is to dissolve as soon as the thing is not. This property is not accidental to obligation. It's not an individual. It's not particular to my promising John to wash his car that I have the obligation which dissolves as soon as I wash his car. It's not an individual obligation. It's universal. So we find again these two features of universality and necessity. It's universal in the sense that everything.
Sorry, just wondering, just trying to sort of make sense of this. would this rechtliches be something like normative?
No.
No?
It's an entity. What do you mean by normative? Are you talking about the
I'm
property?
just trying to
of-
understand what is meant by rechtliches here. So
Oh, the word?
yeah, I understand German, but
Yeah.
and I understand, but I'm just wondering because we're talking about like promising in general. So I guess this is something pre-legal.
This is something pre-legal.
Pre-legal, right?
The-
So what type of normativity are we talking about here?
They are not normative.
It's not normative?
No.
How come?
The word he uses is rechtlich, but this is why they translated it as legal, not to have the connotation of normativity. The examples of claims and obligations and property. So if you're talking about some normativity, it should be added to it. By themselves, they are not normative, and as we see, the a priori laws that govern them are not normative. That is the point. They are a priori laws. They're descriptive.
Okay.
They're a category of objects,
But they don't provide us with any reason for action.
and not in themselves.
Okay. All right.
Follow-up. So, according to Reinach, there's like no object difference between obligations and the color orange, for instance.
They are what?
I just try to make sense of your response. So, according to Reinach, there is no like ontological difference between the color orange and an obligation.
Ontological difference?
Yeah.
They are different categories. Orange is the color, obligation is another place. This is it. Each kind of object is treated differently. We should not confuse different types of objects, and their differences is exactly in the properties that they have. The laws which hold them. They give rise to normativity, but in themselves, actually, I think that even the question, and I talk about an object. The object in itself is not normative, of course. It's just an object. Then the object can give rise to, can have normative significance. Is this your question?
Yeah, maybe. I just. So the idea is that the obligation is distinct from the sort of reasons that it provides them.
Obligation, obligation is just an obligation.
Okay.
Okay, so
It's not that what you ought to. It's not that.
Talking about normativity, kind of reason for action is, well, I think it's just a contemporary. I don't think that Reinach thought about normativity as a reason.
Yeah.
So that's the same Kelly.
Yeah.
Kelly said that there's nothing to do with the reason.
That's true.
But could we explain this rechtliches as a kind of object that gives rise to a normativity? And for example, we can use it in different contexts.
Yeah.
For example, if I say that I will wash your car, it's like just a social norm. But if we write a contract or something, it would be a legal norm. But we still use the same object in two different contexts. Would that be more or less in Reinach's way?
Yes.
Okay.
But I will explain what will be the difference between the legal proposition and the rechtlich obligation. It distinguishes between, and so I will come back to how the normativity comes out of. So what I will say that these, when I say I will promise to wash your car to John, it's my obligation dissolves as soon as I wash his car, and this is it's part of the essence of obligation in the sense that it's necessary and universal, in the sense that the fact that an obligation dissolves as soon as the thing is done is valid for absolutely everything which is an obligation. There are exceptions, and second of all, it's necessary in the sense that that state of affairs cannot fail to hold. It cannot be the case that an obligation does not dissolve as soon as the thing is done. So, as you say again, that he uses this notion a priori, but in the features of universality and necessity, and was criticizing the Kantian notion, which was restricted to the domain of formal or mechanics. Here we are talking about obligation, but we are still in the domain of a priori, and it's not about how to change. It's completely within our grasp. It is about what obligation is. It's all the thing itself. But this is so why many people have said that Reinach has mystified the concept as if there is a third word where obligations exist. He says that this is not something dark or mystical. He says that every state of affairs, which is in this sense universal and necessary, is a priori. And for him, the notion of a priori is something of a third realm, of a third world. And is that when you say that A is B is a priori, the only thing which Reinach means by this is that everything which is A is B and cannot be not B. That is the only sense it has. So it's really mundane. It's something that we could grasp, it's not something mystical, and he's himself against the idea that there is a third world where they exist. It just says that the notion of a theory that at the end I will just use all the time, it's just this notion that when I say that A is B a priori, it means that everything which is A is B, and it cannot be not be. So everything universal cannot be not be necessary. Now, there are other examples of a priori laws which we say that prompting generates obligation thing. There, let me give you some other examples of the a priori of the essential properties of claims and obligations which are generated by the act of promising. They need to have a content. An obligation cannot not have a content. An obligation is not an obligation to do something about something. So this is for again an a priori law. And or every obligation refers to future action. It cannot refer to something past. Or if I have an obligation, it should be me or my actions that should make me realize the concept. If I have the obligation, if I'm the bearer of the obligation, it should be me or my act. Of course, I can have obligation to make something the case to another person, but it should again be me who leads the other person to do the act. So obligation is always the bearer or some actions of the bearer, which should be realized at once. And the other law is that every obligation should have a bearer. So every obligation belongs to, when we're talking about obligations generated by promising, there should be a bearer, something who has promised. And there should be something over against him, we have this obligation, someone who has the claim, the promisee. So we always have this correlative obligation and claim. We have the bearer of the obligation, and correlatively, we have the partner of the obligation, which is the person who has the claim. So I watched the part for John. I'm the bearer of the obligation. John is the bearer of the claim. He's the partner of my obligation. Now, one other actually laws that we count. One other example is that of the a priori laws, essential properties of claims and obligations, that no claim and no obligation begins to exist or is extinguished without some reason. There should always be some sufficient reason to bring about obligation. I said that they're temporal of the same kind, which are as real. So there should be something which brings about, not just there should have a sufficient reason to source, they should have a source. This is why he says that, and this is a Husserlian concept, he says that they are dependent species, claim and obligation are dependent species, and says that if I say, he gives this example, that if I say the movement of a ball, I can perceive the movement of a ball in itself. I see, of course, the ball, if it moves, it's because there was a cause. There was a cause, for example, I had hit it. But the movement of the ball can be perceived and it's through itself. I can see the ball moving. I don't need to go back to its cause. But when we talk about obligations, in order to establish whether an obligation exists or not, I cannot just look at the obligation because, of course, obligations are not perceivable things like trees and houses. So for me to be able to establish whether or not an obligation exists, I need to go back to the source of the obligation. If you ask me, is there an obligation to do something, I should know, for me to know whether or not there is an obligation, I should go back to the source or the reason that had given rise. So it's in this sense that he says that the obligations and claims are dependent species. So they're not something we can look at so as to establish their existence. Now, where we promise, there is one source. Where we promise, there arises same kind of application. The salvation reason for plans and applications to arise. Now, what is a promise? Here's where how we can give rise to application. What is a promise? This is where he introduces the notion of social acts. The social acts are the parentheses. There is this category the category of spontaneous acts. Spontaneous acts are a kind of mental acts that we see. You saw the notion of intentionality and phenomenology. Spontaneous acts are, first of all, intentional. That is, they're directed towards something. They're acts of the mind which have this intention. They're about something. But not only spontaneous acts, not only are they intentional, but also they are a precise sense of acting. The idea is that when I say I have a resolution, I am the person who has the resolution. I have a resolution. And it's intentional. You always have a resolution to do something about something. A resolution to not just exist in itself. Consciousness is always consciousness of something. It's intentional. But when I say I have a resolution, we have to distinguish it from making a resolution. It's the difference between having a resolution and making a resolution, which makes us understand what a spontaneous act is. Making a resolution now is a spontaneous act. So not only we have to have intentionality, but we also have to have the conscious doing of the subject. These are spontaneous acts. Making a resolution is this moment I do something, I bring about something in my mental sphere. It's not a state, it's an act, but it's the conscious doing of the act. As the difference between having a resolution and making a resolution. The subject, it's doing of the subject itself. It's the doing of the subject. It's the actively bringing about something in my mental sphere. So Reinach, I quote, spontaneous acts are those psychic acts in which the self shows itself to be the phenomenal originator of the act. Now, some other examples of spontaneous acts are, for example, deciding, forgiving, praising, blaming, requesting, questioning, asserting. These are all acts of the mind and doings of the mind. Now, there are two distinctions within the category of spontaneous acts. The first distinction is between internal acts. And internal acts are those spontaneous acts which can be completely performed within. I can forgive someone. I can forgive someone because it's an act. I can do it in myself. I don't need to express it to someone. It can be performed only within. But it's necessary for, it's not essential to the act to be announced. But we have another category of spontaneous acts, which are, he says, in need of being heard. And the word that he used here is Phenomenology. So the acts, these are acts which are spontaneous, which are not internal. They need to be expressed in order for them to be performed. They cannot be completely performed within. They have to turn to somebody. They need to address to somebody and grasp for that somebody for them to perform. And the example, the obvious example is commanding. When you command, you cannot command in yourself. It's not an internal act. It cannot perform within you and be over. It needs to be addressed. It needs to turn to somebody, be grasped on it for it to be performed. And this notion of being heard, translation, is of course not being heard by ears. It can be by some real expression. So what is important to being heard is actually being grasped, with the taking in, the conscious taking in by the hearer. So there are, it's not necessarily vocal expression. It can be, we can command someone by writing, and the hearer reads and the command is done. But the essential point is that it should be turned, it should have an address, it should be announced to someone. Otherwise, they could not even be performed. They are performed in a very addressing towards the person and his grasp. Now there is another distinction, another set of distinctions that Reinach introduced among the social acts, which is those which are other directed and those which are not other directed. Other directed coordinates are those in which the act itself it refers to some other person than the subject. The act itself should have another object, there should be another person than the subject itself to whom the act is directed. For example, when I can command myself. We always command someone. We always promise someone. We always forgive someone. Forgiving is also another directed. But for example, deciding is not other directed. For deciding to put there, it may not, the deciding or preferring may not be referred to another person, the subject itself. So these two distinctions are not exactly the same. Here, what is essential is that the act is addressed to another person and be performed within the addressing. Here, the act is as if we have an object for the sentence, performing from someone, requesting something from someone. These mean to the act refers to another person, but it's not the same thing. And as you said, some commentators have confused these two distinctions. And I will make it more explicit when I just say that social acts are actually these. Social acts are those spontaneous acts which are in need of being heard. I think there need to be, you see how much it's like the notion of uptake and performative, the design speech act. So the example is commanding. The example is commanding, requesting, warning, questioning, informing, answering. All of these are social acts in the sense that they need to turn, they cannot be performed within, they need to turn toward be cast towards another person just for the sake of being addressed and being grasped, and they're done. And with whether or not they're other directed or not. Now, most of the social acts are other directed. For example, commanding, request, all the examples that I gave, requesting, commanding, warning, questioning, informing, answering, they're always commanding someone, informing someone, they're always directed to another person, they refer to another person too. But there are some social acts which are not other directed. He gives 3 examples. The example of waiving, revoking, and enacting. We can make a claim. Waiving a claim is a social act, but when you're going to promise to wash John's car, the normal way for the promise to extinguish, for the claim and obligation to extinguish is that I wash the car. But there are other ways for the claim and obligations to vanish. One of them is that John waives his claim, and the other one is that I remove my obligation towards him. Of course, when you claim can go by itself, it's enough that the person has the claim just says, okay, I see that I waive. But for revoking, it should be that the person who has the claim accept my revoking. But both these acts are possible and both of them are social acts. I cannot waive a claim in myself. I have to address to the person who has the obligation. And again, revoking is the same. I cannot do it in myself. I have to turn towards another person to address it and connect to grasp. And enactment is the same. I think we will see it at the end. It's also it's not other directed. We just don't enact to someone. We just enact. And we don't waive to something. We just waive a claim. It's not directed to other person. So this is the category of social acts. Those acts of the mind which are intentional and which are in the being grasped by the agency. Now, so we see that forgiving, for example, forgiving is an undirected act. I have to always forgive someone, but it's an internal. I can forgive myself. I don't need to. It doesn't need to get addressed. So with this character, so what is necessary for the social acts to perform is that the act be made known to some second person, made known to some second person. It doesn't need to refer to another person, but it should be made known and grasped by another person. Exactly with the enacting. When we enact, there should be someone who grasps the enactment for it to become efficacious, but we don't enact to someone or enact someone. Now with this calculator, we see that it's how much it's similar to the notion of outtake that we saw in spatial theories. There should be definitely communicative intentions that we saw there. Here should grasp or have to manifest my intention, etc. Now, Reinach uses the notion of hereby. He says that we can use the notion of hereby to refer to an event which is happening along with the performance of the social act. He says that if I say I cannot say I hereby experience a pain. That is it's not done. But I can say I hereby command. And he also says that if I say I commanded, this is not a social act because it's just a report on the whole social. I'm just describing the whole anterior social act to see exactly how much this is similar to Austin's ideas about the idea about the fact that explicit performance should be present tense, first person, singular, etc. Now, the important point is that social acts are a unified act. Social act is not separated into a mental act, into some mental experience and a statement of it. It's not dependent. It's not divided into an independent act and a statement of it which would be accidental to it. No, we cannot separate these two aspects. If I don't address the command, it is still not performed. It's not the command is something interior which is done and then I accidentally express it. It's not like forgiving. I can forgive someone, I can decide for something, and then I accidentally just also state that I did it or state that I'm doing it. But this statement is accidental to forgiving and deciding. But with social acts, there is no accidentality. They are performed even if they cannot be separated from their expression. It's necessary that they address the other, and without being addressed, there is no act. So there is not a separate experience. But they are performed through and within the expression. But so the mental act and its linguistic expression are just abstractly distinguished or conceptual. It's a conceptual distinction. Otherwise, there is this is the point. The point is that the act is done through the addressing, so it hasn't in pre-existence. Now, the other point is that this is an a priori law which holds about social acts, which is that they presuppose, however, some mental state. For example, when informing presupposes that I become victim. Asking a question presupposes that I am uncertain. Commanding presupposes that I have some will to bring about the thing through the addressing. All of the social acts presuppose a mental state, but they are not expression of those mental states. They just presuppose those mental. They are an act all its own. It's not an accidental to those. It's not accidental to those mental experiences to be expressed. Without the expression, the act doesn't exist. But it remains that usually all the social acts that we perform in addressing, they have a presupposition of some mental state. But we cannot say that the social act is the mental state plus its expression. And we cannot at all say that. Of course, for example, I can to show you why it's different. I can form a desire to know something. Forming a desire is a spontaneous act. To form a desire is a doing. And this forming a desire to know something can motivate my asking the question. It's an inner act. Forming a desire, is done. It's an inner act, it's an internal act. It's not a social act. It's completely itself. It can motivate my asking a question, but it can of course not be identified with it. It's not identical to forming a desire because it can be completely itself. It's not identical to asking a question. It's another act for itself. It's an internal act. So it's an a priori necessity that every social act presupposes some mental act. And now the objection obviously is that we have sometimes some social acts which are not, when we don't have the cases of insincerities. I may not have a mental state. I may ask a rhetorical question without really being uncertain, or I may inform you about something about which I'm not convinced. And Reinach's answer to this objection is that, of course, and this is what we call modification of social acts. This is what we call pseudo performances of social acts. And because if they are pseudo performances, they are not genuine by their nature. They exclude the mental state we presuppose. For example, it's a pseudo informing, but its nature excludes that to be convinced of what we are informing. Otherwise, it would not be pseudo. So this is his answer to this question. Now, this is one of the modifications of social acts that Reinach treats. There are many other modifications. There are 3 other modifications. One of them is that social acts can be done by proxy in the name of another person. This notion of proxy is something that, for example, Austin and Searle didn't treat. So Reinach had treatment of these as well. So this is why we say that he is pure social act is systematic. Now, promising, let's go into promising. Promising now is a social act. Promising an act which is performed inside the addressing, the addressing. Now, note that because you're humans, we have to express it in some physical medium. Because we don't have access to our interacting, have some physical medium to express the social act. But what is essential to a social act being a social act, what is essential property of social act is it's not the physical expression, it's the need to be turned towards someone, to be addressed. This is what is essential to social acts. Now, promising is a social act, as well as other directed social acts, because we always promise to someone. But the mental state which is presupposed by the social property is the intention to bring about the presence of the promise. This is, as we could imagine, having a promise to do A, the mental state which is presupposed is that I have the intention to do A. But we see that the act of promising, as I said, is not the sum of the intention plus the expression. It is an act all its own. This is how we see that how have Reinach criticized the traditional ideas of promising as being analyzed in terms of expression and intention. Promising is not the expression of intention plus an expression. It cannot exist. It can only exist in the expression, in the very expression. So promising is a sui generis act. It's irreducible. Like other social acts, it's whole that is done in the declaration, in its being addressed. But what you are declaring when you promise is declaration of the promise itself. What you're expressing is the promise itself. It's not an intention. That means it's the promise itself. It's an act on its own. Sui generis. That's it. And so when I say that, and the difference can be seen in the. Instead, if I say I want to do this for you, it can be a promise. Or it can also be an informing. I say, I want to do this, it can be just expressing my intention to do this for you. It's not necessarily a promise. How would you understand if it's promise or not if the context is sufficiently clear for you to understand my utterance of the promise? But if it's not a promise, it is what? It's informing. I'm informing you. Either I'm promising you when I say I will do this for you, or I'm informing you about my intention. But we see that informing and promising are 2 different social acts. Informing doesn't give rise to obligations, but promising gives rise to obligations. So if the fact that there are misunderstandings possible in the context, that if I don't make explicit my act, but if I just say, I will do this for you, this is the possibility of misunderstanding not only abolishes the difference between different social acts, but also confirms as well. It just confirms that there are different social acts. The fact that I may be doing the social act of informing or that I may be doing the social act of promising, and there is this misunderstanding possibility, it's just a mark that these social acts are different. And all these which I talked about were a priori, that the need of being addressed is an a priori viable social act. And that they are not reducible, that they presuppose a mental state. All these are a priori laws, or things which we just avoid by insight, by looking phenomenologically to this phenomenon, we can understand these the social these a priori laws about them, and the things I talked about didn't seem very bizarre to you because you understood it as if they have this set of evidence. And Reinach, this is why he says that we cannot even forget these rules because they are not invented or stipulated. So we cannot really talk about forgetting these rules. Whenever we look at these entities again, we can see these a priori connections which hold them. And this is one of the marks for Reinach to say that these laws are a priori. The notion of forgetting doesn't have really any sense once we grasp them. Now we can see this theory from, no, it's not a theory, promising with this conception promising the social act as a whole is to generate act as a response to Hume's criticism of the common of the view that promising is established by conventions. So Reinach says that Hume was right to think that no expression of intention, expressing my intention to do something would never give rise to an obligation. No obligation, because obligation is a notion of right, it's a concept of right, and it's not a natural phenomenon. It cannot expressing an intention. It does not have this capacity to bring out concepts of right. Neither expression of obligation, the view to obligation. I say that I intend to oblige myself. Neither would give rise to a real obligation. So Reinach said that Hume was right to think that no expression, no declaration of intention would give rise to promising. And Hume, because he said that we cannot, no expression of intention could give rise to promising, then the puzzle of promising is how is it then that obligations are generated for promising? This is what we know as the puzzle of promising, the norm of promising, what is its nature. And so Hume concluded that promises are human inventions. He said that a promise wouldn't be intelligible before human conventions had established it. Now Reinach thinks that exactly he argues against Hume that promising had meaning before human conventions had established it, exactly contrary to Hume, and his diagnostic is that Hume's error was to try to find an experience of the mind which is expressed by a promise. That was Hume's question. He wanted to find an experience of the mind which is expressed by the promise. And Reinach says that this is the error. There is no experience of the mind which is expressed by promise, as if promise is something before the expression. But this is not. Promise is nothing. It doesn't have existence apart from the expression itself. So Hume's error was that he wanted to find an expression of promising as if promising is something in the mind that we accidentally expressed, and this was his error. Promising is an act of its own, and therefore, of course, obligations cannot be generated by mere declaration of intentions. As we saw, that declaration of intentions can just be against of informing, they're not promising. Informing is not promising. But then, Reinach's conclusion is that the existing mentality of any human being. Now, in order to, first of all, we have that, we see that with social acts are just a category of acts which themselves give rights, which are subject to a priori laws, and which have, again, nothing to do with positive law. Of course, many social acts don't have legal significance, but those which have, again, are independent of positive law. They have the laws which, independent of any system of positive law, they are governed by some essential properties, social acts. And he calls this a mechanism of social interaction. This is the a priori laws of the social sphere, the social interaction sphere. Now, to recapitulate, with regard to rechtlich entities, they are not created by positive law. They are even presupposed by the positive law, and such that the structure of the positive law can only become intelligible through the structure of the non-positive sphere of rights, a non-positive sphere, non-pre-positive sphere of rechtlich entities. And then we have social acts, which are as well governed by a priori sphere of social interactions, and has nothing to do with legal codes. So what Reinach does actually is that he rejects classical theories of jurisprudence. On the one hand, he says, I think it's evident, his work can be seen as a critique of traditional legal positivism, and the idea that the individual law is positive by human beings, man-made or enacted, such that not every legal norm, but also every legal concept is a creation of positive norm. But on the other hand, his criticism of legal positivism does not lead to an application of natural law theory, jurisprudence. Reinach is as well against natural law jurisprudence because a priori laws are not some higher laws. They are not grounded in human nature, nor in any divine, nor implanted by God, nor derived from human nature or reason. They are laws of being. They are laws about what things are. They don't have anything with some high order. They are is a lot of essence, laws of being. They are contrary to natural law theorists who thought about some normative laws, some higher norms that have to govern our practices, and which tell us what to do, which prescribe. A priori laws are not normative. They are actually descriptive. They are not. They don't prescribe what we ought to do, because they are not about the just order of the things. They are just about how things are. They are just statements of facts about the world. So first of all, and they are independent of our rest. So first of all, a priori laws provide a hidden foundation, the hidden foundation for a positive law, and they're not derived in any way from human nature or from some divine source, and they're neither creations or productions of positive law, and they exist independently, antecedently of any human foundation or construction. And second, they're not odd statements. They don't prescribe what ought to be the case or what we ought to do. Rather, they are what we can say eidetic propositions. Eidetic coming from eidos, meaning the essence. They are essential propositions. They are about how things are in the world. They are completely descriptive, no normative. So Reinach's essentialism opens a third realm in the dichotomy between a human positive law or a high or just law. There is a pure science of right, the a priori theory of right, which the a priori which is found by the positive law, which is not created by the positive law, and is presupposed by the positive law. So correlatively, if these laws are mere descriptions or statements of facts about legal entities and do not prescribe what we ought to do, nor pertain to what is right or just to do, then they are neither legal norms nor moral norms. They are not norms, actually. They are just statements of fact. And this is the last thing that I want to say in 10 minutes. The distinction between these a priori laws and moral laws and enacted legal norms. Moral norms and legal norms. To start with moral norms, Reinach says that promising, this is the approval, promising as such generates obligation and claim. So legal entities like claims and obligations can spring from free acts of the person. Free act of the person like might be something to promise. All of a sudden, this gives rise to claims and obligations. So rechtlich obligations and claims, claims of the right, the sphere of right, can spring from free act of the person. They can be transferred. I can transfer my claim to someone else. They can be abolished. I can annul my claim. I can waive my claim. But when we have moral norms, with moral norms, it cannot be transferred. He said, he gives the example of the moral rights of everyone has the right to development of his personality. He thinks that, he says that this cannot be transferred. This cannot be annulled neither. We cannot abolish this right. We can, of course, not use it, but we cannot make the case that I don't have this right anymore. And moreover, this is one difference between moral norms and a priori sphere of law, a priori propositions. The second difference is about the content. Moral obligations, for example, it's necessary for them that their content be morally right. So the moral, they are grounded, moral obligations are grounded in the moral rightness of their content. The content of the norm should be morally right to give rise to moral obligations. But when we're talking about the obligations of right, obligations, we don't have anything to do with the content. The content is not important. Promising gives rise to obligations. Whether or not the content is morally right or not. This is just a fact about promising. This is what promising is. So rights and obligations which can be generated by promising are pre-legal obligations and not moral obligations. And the fact that moral obligations should be suppose the moral rightness of the content, whereas obligations of rights and obligations generated by promising has nothing at all to do with their moral content from their being generated. Is the second argument against the fact that rechtlich obligations are not reducible to moral obligations, and therefore a priori propositions have nothing to do with moral propositions. Now the problem is don't we have moral obligations to keep our promises? So we say about Reinach that he doesn't accept the moral duty of promising. I think that we should be someone more fair to Reinach. We ask this question: do we have a moral obligation to perform promises? And said, of course we have. Of course we have a moral obligation to keep our promises. But this obligation is when we say that promising generates obligation, this by itself doesn't create any moral obligation. This is just a statement of the fact that promising is how it is. This is what the promising is. But how is it that we ought to keep one's promises? He says that the obligation to keep one's promises is, yes, it's a moral obligation, but it's not grounded in the promising. It's grounded in the notion of obligation as such. So the idea is that the obligation, the rechtlich obligation that I have and I promise, it is generated, it is grounded in the nature of promise. This obligation, rechtlich obligation, is grounded in the nature of promise. Now, the moral duty to fulfill the obligation, this is grounded in the. So I have promising. This generates obligation. This obligation is grounded in nature of promise. Then I have a moral duty to fulfill that obligation. Moral duty or moral obligation. It's called moral obligation, it's called a duty. Then I have a moral duty to fulfill my obligation, but this moral duty is grounded in the nature of obligation as such. Obligation itself is such that it's grounded in it, it's such. The notion of obligation is such that we have a moral duty to fulfill it. And he calls this an a priori law of morality. This is an a priori law of morality that all obligations should be fulfilled. If there's an obligation, they should be fulfilled. And it's grounded in the nature of the notion, the nature of obligation itself. And then now here we still don't have it doesn't have anything to do with the content. If the content is immoral or not. What happens if the content is immoral? Here, whenever there is an obligation, there is a moral duty to fulfill. Now, if the content is immoral, what happens is that there is a moral duty, the moral obligation not to fulfill the content which is immoral comes from the wrongness of the content itself. So, if the content is wrong, morally wrong, it grounds the fact that you ought not fulfill the obligation. So there is a third level when we talked about content. We have because I said the moral obligations are grounded in the rightness of their content. They're grounded in the moral rightness of the content. So if the content of the obligation is not right, if the moral is right, then I have a duty not to fulfill this obligation. But this is the third level. It doesn't have anything to do with the moral duty that I have myself because I have an obligation. So the three levels is that, first of all, when I promise I have an obligation, that's a fact. Then, because I have an obligation, then I have a moral duty to fulfill obligation. This is a moral agreement. And if ever the content of the obligation is not morally right, then I have a moral duty not to fulfill the obligation because the content of the obligation is morally wrong. Now there seems to be conflict if there is if I promise you to kill someone, I promise you to murder someone. Now we can see the conflict here. Because I promise you to murder someone, thereby I have an obligation to murder someone. Because I have an obligation to murder someone, now I have a moral duty to fulfill an obligation. Which has nothing to do still with the content. Now, because my content is immoral, murdering is wrong, now I have a moral duty not to murder someone. So we have two conflicting moral duties. On one hand, I have a moral duty to murder someone because I have a moral duty to fulfill my obligation. So I have a moral duty to murder. On the other hand, I have a moral duty not to murder because the content of the murder is morally wrong. So here we have conflicting, what should we do? And here Reinach says that we have to act according to the higher duty. And the higher duty would tell us that in this case we should not finally murder the person. But this is, and he says that it's again says that it's again a priori law that one have a moral duty to listen to the higher demand. This is itself a moral duty. Now here that we have this conflicting, it doesn't mean that the problem is that if I have on the one hand the moral duty to fulfill the obligation and murder the person, and on the other hand I have a moral duty not to murder the person, it seems contradictory, but it's not, because they are grounded in different things. This moral duty is grounded in the obligation that I have. Because I have an obligation, I have a moral duty to fulfill. But this moral duty not to murder is grounded not in the obligation as such, but in the wrongness of the concept. So they are different things. They are different matters. And this is how we decide by listening to the higher demand. And the last, I'm so sorry. The last concept is so moral obligations or rights are some ought to be, they are norms, they are moral norms, but rechtlich obligations are not norms. They are just statements of facts, things that how things as such. So one is morally, we morally ought to keep on to promises. It is a moral issue. We ought to keep on to promises, but it doesn't at all touch the rechtlich sphere. If I have a moral obligation to keep my promises, it is because a priori laws have told us that promising generates obligations. Precisely because the obligation is generated, and then separately I have a moral obligation to fulfill. And so, of course, there is a moral duty to realize the concept of promise, but it's precisely because obligations spring from promises as such, as a matter of fact, and as what promising is, which has nothing to do with any moral obligation. Now, moral obligations or rights are ought to be, but rechtlich obligations are not normative. And I said finish by distinguishing now this a priori sphere of law from enactments, because yes, because I said also that these are not norms, they're descriptions of fact. And they're not only moral norms, neither they are legal. They're not legal norms. And the objection, you can understand this through the objection that if Reinach is holding that the sphere of law we have these pre-positive a priori truth, how is it? How could it be the case if they're self-evident and immediate, etc., how independent of our grasp? How is it possible that positive law can sometimes find itself in so flagrant contradiction to these laws of a priori essence? For example, we say that a promise generates obligation for itself, always, necessarily and universally. But how is it the case that when you have a minor may not have obligations in front of the court? So you may have this positive law that minors do not incur obligations in the eye of the law, and it, of course, contradicts the idea that every obligation, every promise generates obligation. Now, this is how Reinach answers. And that there is no contradiction. There is no contradiction because contradiction is always between two assertive propositions. When I say A is B and A is not B, that is a contradiction. But when I say A is B, it cannot be in contradiction with the question. Is A not B? Is A not B? Cannot be in contradiction with A is B because they are not. It's the question. So whenever we have a contradiction, we should have two asserting propositions which are contradicting in the context. Now, what Reinach says is that legal propositions of law, positive law, they are not, they are not asserting propositions. When a priori laws are asserting propositions because they are statements of facts. They are statements of fact, they're true or false. They are true in this case because it's necessary in yours. But when he gives the example of the German civil code, the first paragraph says that the ability of man to be a subject of right begins with the completion of birth. Says this is not an asserting proposition. It's not the case that there is an independent fact that you're reporting. We are making it the case that it be such that the ability of man to be a subject of right begins by the utterance itself, by the enactment. So these are not asserting propositions, they are judgments. They are enactments. So the civil code enacts that it ought to be such, and that the ability of man starts with birth, and it becomes such. We do not have assertion. Then Reinach says that of course when this enacts, so this is an enactment. Now, when it's exactly like declaration, and it says that when now we see this sentence in textbooks of law for students, there it is an assertion. It is an assertion. But in the first, but this assertion is grounded in the first paragraph of this German Civil Code. But the first paragraph of the German Civil Code itself is not an assertion; it's an enactment. So there is no contradiction. There is also the only thing which is that there is, as I say, some deviation. We deviate. Positive law can deviate from the a priori sphere of law, and we can also see this in there is this relation also to the notion of direction. I think that I think it's. I thought it's important, but now I don't have time, so it's not very much important. But Reinach says that there is assertions of conforming acts. Conforming acts, when we have assertions that there is a different reality, in reality that we report. But enactments are not assertions, and we don't even questions and promising that do not have this direction of it to be conforming acts. To the contrary, they want to bring some change in the world. Now, what are enactments? Enactments are social acts. Enactment is a kind of social act. It is not an internal act. It needs to be addressed to another person. But it's not the same thing as commands. Enactments are not the same thing as command. There are two different social acts. For example, commanding is other directed. You should always command someone. But enacting, you should not enact to someone. Of course, there should be someone to whom it's addressed for it to be clarifications, but it's not other directed. So it's not the same thing as commanding. As well, there are two other differences, which is that if commanding refers to the action of the person, there should be always some action that should be performed by the person to whom you command, but enactments need not be action. It can be like the first paragraph of the German Civil Code. It doesn't prescribe an action. It's not about an action that ought to be. And the intention, the mental state, which is presupposed by the act of the social act of enactment, is the intention that something ought to be. That is the intention, that is the mental state which presupposes the social act of commanding. And now, commanding, there are not true or false, because they're necessarily propositions. They can be grounded or ungrounded, efficacious or not efficacious. When they're efficacious, being efficacious is like a felicity condition. When they are efficacious, they bring some change in the world. And when they're efficacious, they presently something, upon the announcing, presently something changes in the world. It becomes real at the moment of causing it. And since enactments generates ought to be, if the person has the authority, if the enactment is efficacious, through the very utterance, something ought to be. And we can then enact arbitrarily everything we want. We can enact that things be exact contrary to how a priori law tells us that things are. But this doesn't mean that a priori law, it doesn't touch the validity of a priori law. It precisely shows the validity of the a priori law, because first of all, enactments are themselves results of social acts of enacting, which is itself governed by a priori laws. And second of all, usually the motive we have for deviating, the motive we have for enacting, is precisely to deviate from a priori laws, which itself presupposes that they have their validity. This validity that we want to deviate from. And Reinach, one of the reasons that Reinach is not about his theory of a priori laws, he's not defending natural law theory, is that it's not that we can deviate from a priori laws. He says that we should deviate because they're always practical matters. Of course, promising general obligations, but we should not exploit the lack of experience of a young man who is minor. So practical issues, moral values, practical values, everything which can take the value in human societies may become a motive to ground the fact that we enact some ought to be, which deviates from the a priori theory of laws, and in this case, the a priori proposition will be suspended. So he says that the essential law which exists in itself and whose validity is even presupposed by the deviating enactment is blocked out by the enactment. And so if we just finish by saying that if we enact efficaciously, that the claim does not arise from a promise made by a minor, the enactment presupposes in this case that the claim is absent as a result of enactment, and so it rests on those very essential laws governing social acts, the validity of which it calls into question. So positive law can posit any concept as valid. It's grounded in the social act of enactment, and although it can deviate, and it should sometimes deviate for the good of the community, the law's spirit still is constituted by those a priori principles. To finish, I just quote one sentence: nowhere else do we see more clearly than here the untenability of that strange reversal whereby one wants to support self-evident essential laws by referring to cultural institutions which themselves can be clarified and explained only by those same essential laws.